Hey, how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be filming my best books of 2024. And this is always one of my favorite videos to make every single year on my channel. You know, in the year of 2024, I've read over 200 books. I think I'm at about like 215 books right now at the time that I'm filming this. I like to film these before the very end of the year because I do have a very clear idea at this moment for what my top 15 books of the year are. And yes, on this list, I'm going to have a list of 15 books as well as 10 honorable mentions. You have no idea. I've had a really great reading year, and it was really hard for me to even narrow down my list of top 10 honorable mentions. I ended up cutting it down from like 20 because I had so many incredible reads this year. So I will very quickly go through all of my honorable mentions and then we'll work our way to the top 15. And these were all books that I've been thinking about so much throughout the year that left a really big impact on me for one reason or another. And just all books that I still love and highly recommend. So some of my honorable mentions this year include The Wedding People. And The Wedding People is like a contemporary, like literary fiction type of story that just really moved me. And I think this book is so impressive because it talks about such a serious and dark subject matter, but it does it in such a light-hearted and fun way. And I just really love this. I connected with the characters in this a lot. I really want to reread this soon. I also have Earthlings as an honorable mention because this book has stayed on my mind so much since I read it in September. I have The Other Side of Night. This is like one of the only thrillers that has ever made me cry. We have Diavala by Jennifer Thorne, which was actually one of my book troop picks, and it was a 5-star. It was one of my favorite horror books that I read this year. And then we have another book troop pick, which was We Used to Live Here. This was definitely one of the most thought-provoking and like interesting, mind-bendy books that I've read in a long time. I also have The Reformatory by Tananarive Due as another honorable mention because this was another book troop pick. I swear my book club was actually really successful this year. And this was a very hard-hitting, long horror book. This one's more historical fiction, but it packs such an emotional punch at the end of this book. I also have Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. This one is a horror novella that I was very impressed by, and I really emotionally connected with this when I read it earlier this year. And then I also have The Memory Police as another honorable mention because the more that I think about this book, the more that I'm like, whoa, like this book is just so wild. It's a translated Japanese book from the 90s, and it's just so thought-provoking and so interesting, and it almost made my top 15. All right, so jumping right into my top 15. We're gonna be working our way from book number 15 all the way up to my number 1 spot of the year. So coming in at number 15, I have The Laws of the Skies. This one is a horror novella. I've heard this book get compared to like Lord of the Flies and The Troop, and I think that both of those comparisons are definitely accurate. This one is about a group of 6-year-old children who go into the forest for this camping trip, and then things take a sudden turn and things get very violent and graphic and dangerous for them right away. And this one is almost written in the way where it reads like a fairy tale. Like, I don't know how to describe that, but the writing in this book was so atmospheric and so vivid and so beautifully written. Like, I was really impressed with the writing style in this. It really feels like you're like right there in the forest with these children, and like the things that were happening in this book, like I was on the edge of my seat the entire time I was reading this. It was almost like the writer was like reading to you and like breaking the fourth wall to you as the reader at times, which I also thought was like very powerful and very moving. I just thought the writing style was so unique at times, and then the ending of this book was also very like heartbreaking but like really moving at the same time. I don't know, this just really worked for me. Like, this is everything that I'm looking for when it comes to horror novellas, and I had a really great time reading this. It was definitely one of the most memorable books that I read this year. Coming in at number 14 on my list is going to be The Center, which this one is a horror novel that I read back in September, and I didn't know too much about this when I jumped in, but this book is so wildly fascinating to me. Like, the concept of this is so cool because this book basically talks about this place where you can go that's called The Center, where you can pay a ton of money to essentially learn a language in like 10 days. But this place is very like hush hush, and it's like invite only, and they're very like mysterious and secretive with like what they're doing there. And I love stories like this that have like a really weird and unique concept and really show like the extremes of something like this. I think the writing style in this book was so freaking good, and there were so many great quotes about, you know, language and like translation and like why those things matter. There was also a lot of really great social commentary about language in this book. Like, one of the quotes that I pulled was when they said gratitude and admiration when a white person speaks a non-white language, and only contempt and indignation for non-white people who don't speak English. And just like the discussion about like learning language in general in this book was so fascinating to me, especially because our main character in this book, she works as a translator, like that's her job. So like there was a lot of really interesting talk in this book about like what it means to translate something from another language, and how like there are words in other languages that we don't have words for in English. And it was just so much interesting conversation about that. But then the horror elements in this book were equally strong and very interesting. I also loved the discussion about female friendships in this book in particular. I loved how there were so many conversations in this book about how like friendships can be just as important and valuable as romantic relationships. There were some really great quotes too. Like, one that I pulled was when they said, "The slow burning love of female friendship that keeps the world turning. Like, damn, like that is beautiful. Another great quote that I wanted to share with you is when they said, there can be something quite devastating in feeling a comfort that you can barely remember. It can make you grieve, if I'm honest, for something that you'd always felt a vague sense of loss over, but never knew for certain what you were missing. Oh my god, like the writing in this book was so stunning. I think about it all the time. All right, coming in at number 13 on my list is going to be Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. And I think this book had to make my top favorites of the year list just because of how unique and interesting of a premise this book has. I mean, in this story, we're following this gay man named Misha, and he is a writer, and he writes for like TV and movies, and he's working on this current TV shows when like the higher ups tell him that they're gonna need him to kill off the gay characters in the show for the algorithm and for the show to do well on the season finale. And he's kind of like torn because like he really doesn't want to do that, and he doesn't want to have to do that, but they're kind of like threatening him in this way that they're like, well, we'll just find somebody else to do the job if you're not gonna do it. And obviously like there's so much social commentary packed into this book about how like gay characters never get a happy ending and they always have to have some kind of tragedy in order to be interesting. And like what I was not expecting in this book was that there would be such great asexual representation in this as well, because his best friend in this book is this woman who is asexual and aromantic, and I really loved to see that representation in this book too. But like this book was so genuinely creepy. Like there's a scene that takes place on an airplane that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I read this book in August. Like genuinely one of the creepiest scenes that I think that I've ever read in my life. I was literally listening to it on audio while I was at the gym, and I was getting like full body goosebumps and like freaking out. This was just such a standout to me from all of the horror that I read this year as something that was like really unique and really different, and it packed so much social commentary, but in a way that didn't feel too forced. And I just really loved it. I just really vibed with this. Even now, I still think the ending of this book is something that I don't like love the ending necessarily, and I think a little bit, it kind of like goes over my head a little bit, but I had to include this book on my list anyways because of all of the things that I loved about this book were just so strong. All right, the next book on my list coming in at number 12 is gonna be the most fun we ever had. This one, it had to make my list because this one is a literary fiction book about these sisters. So we're following 4 sisters, much like, you know, like Little Women. But this book is not just about, you know, the 4 sisters. We also do follow their parents. We follow their parents, Marilyn and David, when they met in the 1970s. So we kind of do get the story of like how their parents met in between the chapters of like what's going on in the present day. But the story with the daughters in this book is quite interesting because when one of the girls was a teenager, she got pregnant with a baby that she wasn't ready for, and so she gave it up for adoption, and her family never really knew about it. And now the story's taking place 15 years later, you know, when she has a husband of her own, children of her own, and this young boy, Jonah, that she ended up giving up for adoption, he's only 15 years old, and he's gonna be coming back into their family. And this book was just, oh my god, like there was something about the writing in this book that was so beautiful and that I connected with so much, you know, because as somebody who's like really close to, you know, my sister and my parents, I feel like I really connected with these characters because there was so much talk in this book about how like you just have like the perfect set of parents. Like you couldn't have asked for better parents, and you're worried that like you're never gonna find a love in your life that's as great as the love that you have from your parents. Like there was a lot of talk about that in this book, and I was like, oh my god, like, these characters, David and Marilyn, they reminded me so much of my mom and dad that I just really felt so connected to this and to this story. This is just a story that I'm never gonna forget, and it really meant a lot to me to read this because I felt very seen by these characters, and so that's the main reason why it ended up in my favorites of the year. I loved this so much, and I think if you're the kind of person that really enjoys like a family drama, or if you liked, you know, like Little Women or like Little Fires Everywhere, I feel like you would really love this as well. All right, coming in at number 11 is going to be Forget Me Not by Julie Soto. This is a romance book that like completely took me off guard this year. I don't know, I think for me, this book just like checked every single box for like what I'm personally looking for in a romance book, and I think that's why it worked for me so much, because in this story, we're following this girl named Emma, and she is a wedding planner in this book, and I love romances that follow weddings, but I think this one was especially fun because we get so much detail about like her work and her job and what she's doing. And then the love interest in this book is this guy named Elliot Bloom, and his family owns this flower shop that they also do weddings, you know, like they do the flowers for the weddings. So there's a lot of times where they're gonna have to like work together because she's a wedding planner and his family runs like the flower shop. In this story, it's almost like they're getting the second chance to be together again. Like I think this is almost like a second chance romance, which is why I'm surprised that I loved it as much as I did, because these two, they kind of had something going on when they were a little bit younger, which we do get flashback chapters of, so we do get to see their time together when they were younger. And then in the present day, we get to see what's going on with them after they're no longer speaking, after something has happened. And I also like this because we do get dual point of view. I believe it's that we get her point of view in the present day, and then we get his chapters in the flashbacks. I don't know, I just really loved the way that this book was written. I loved these characters so much. I was shipping it so hard, and I feel like the steamy scenes in this book were so well written that I was rooting for them. I was giddy, I was smiling. Like this just had everything everything that I'm looking for in a romance. It was such a fun time. All right, coming in at number 10 on my list is going to be The Measure by Nikki Ehrlich. And this is another one that like completely surprised me with how much I loved this. This one is so unique. This one's kind of like a sci-fi-ish book. You get 8 different perspectives in this book, and we're following all of these people who they wake up in this world one day where they find on their doorstep there's like a little wooden box with a piece of string in it, and that string represents how much longer you have left to live. So it is a little bit ambiguous because you're like, oh my god, well, how long do I actually have? Like, some of the strings are very short, some of them are very long, so they don't know an exact amount of days or like what age they're gonna die, but they just know how much time they have left based on the length of the string. And this book is so wildly fascinating. Like, this is the type of light sci-fi that I really love. Like, this really worked for me. Even though there were 8 different perspectives in this book, I thought all of them were so unique and interesting, and they all contributed something to the story for me. I also think with such a unique concept like this, like, I loved that the author really explored like different things that could happen. Like, well, what if, like, how is this going to impact the world? Like, there would be like dating apps where they're like long strings only. They don't want to date somebody that has a short string because they know they're going to die soon. Or like how this would affect like getting a loan. Like, they don't want to give a loan to somebody that has a short string. Like, how the people that have the long strings, like, they start to get more adventurous and they start to do all these things that are like near death experiences because they know that they're not going to die. Like, I don't know, the way that this impacts like so many different things about these characters and their lives, the way the government would try to control things with this, and like everything that you could imagine for what the world would be like for if this was a real thing was explored in this book, and I thought it was so interesting. This was just definitely one of the most thought-provoking books that I read this year. I think if you have a book club, that this would be like the perfect book to discuss with a book club because there are so many different conversations that you could have about this book. I was surprised that the ending kind of made me emotional and that it impacted me in that way because I didn't really feel that emotionally connected with it, I guess, until the very ending, because then I was like, oh wow, like, am I gonna cry? All right, coming in at number 9 on my list is going to be On the Same Page by Haley Cass. And this one is one of my favorite romance books that I've read this year, and I think it's my favorite like sapphic female romance that I've ever read. I loved this so much, and I think I loved this romance as much as I did because this was written in a way that just really appeals to me. Like, this is exactly the kind of romance writing that I enjoy. And literally, even though this book is like 450 something pages long, it flew by for me because of how obsessed I was with the romance in this. So what I really like in this story is that we're following these 2 girls named Riley and Gianna, and they both actually met in college when they were going to Boston University together, and they didn't like each other when they first met each other, which is fun because I do love like a hate to love. I love like the roommates to lovers trope. You know, they were roommates in college, and we do get the flashback chapters of like how they met when they were in college, so that's very fun to read. And then in the present day, it's taking place like 10 years later when they're actually best friends. Like, they became best friends after they were roommates. And now Riley's working for the Boston News, and Gianna is an influencer, and she has her own business and she works for herself, which, you know, I personally found Gianna to be so relatable for some of those things because, you know, I also work for myself. I have my own business. Like, I just found her really relatable as a businesswoman, and I loved this. Oh my god, the tension between them, even though this had a lot of tropes that I don't typically love. I'm not the biggest fan of like friends to lovers unless it's gay, apparently. Like, I think if you make anything gay, even with tropes that I don't usually like in romance, I end up liking it a lot more because the freaking tension between them, oh my god, it was insane. And I just love them together. Like, I adored them, and the fact that like they didn't really like each other when they were in college, oh my god, I loved it. Like, the character growth from the time that they were in college until they were older, like, I loved seeing the character growth. I liked that it was going back and forth between the past and the present day so that you could get a real idea for like how they became friends in the first place, you know? Because I feel like that's always my issue with like the friends to lovers romances, is that I need to see like how they became friends, you know? Like, I need to see some of their early days together to fully appreciate when they finally do get together. And this book was just so good. It was so well written. Like, by the time they actually were getting together, I was like, oh my god, I was on the edge of my seat. Like, I was giddy. I was like kicking my feet and screaming, you know? And I think that's a really good sign for like a well-written romance. Coming in at number 8 is, I think it's my favorite romance that I've read this year, and it's Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. Oh my gosh, you have no idea. I went back and forth for so long. Like, is this one my favorite romance? Is On the Same Page my favorite romance? I don't know. I loved them both so much. It's really hard for me to choose, but I think I could confidently say that this one was my favorite romance that I read this year because, oh my god, this book just hit me so hard. I loved it so much. And this book, you know, I think it's really interesting because this book kind of has like a silly premise, if you will. It's like a very lighthearted, fun premise where like we're following this girl named Emma, Emma, and she thinks that she's cursed because every guy that she breaks up with ends up going on to find the love of his life, like after he dates her. And then she meets this guy named Justin online who also has the same problem. And so they're like, oh my god, maybe if we like date each other, it'll cancel it out. And like we don't have to worry about this curse anymore. And so like the book starts off with like a really fun, almost like lighthearted, silly premise. But then this story actually ends up being like so heavy and so emotional and so hard hitting. I think it just really took me off guard how emotional the story ended up getting, but like it just really worked for me. Like, I don't know, there was something about Emma and Justin as characters, like they just felt so real. Like they felt so fleshed out. All of their problems felt very real to me. There's a lot of, you know, discussion in this book about their families and about their relationship with their mothers specifically. That was just very hard hitting and very beautiful. Like, I don't know, dude, Abby Jimenez is like an incredible romance writer, and I've really loved the last few books that she's come out with, but I think this one has to be like my favorite out of her recent 3 that she just came out with, because I loved this so much. Like everything about this book worked for me. I can't wait to reread this book again in the future because it's not just the romance in this book that I love about it. I feel like there's also a lot of really interesting plot happening in this book, and there was even moments at the end of this book, like plot-wise, that really surprised me. I was like, how are you gonna throw in a plot twist in a romance book? Like, I didn't see it coming. It was interesting. And this book made me cry. This book definitely made me cry, and I feel like anytime a romance can make me cry like this, I just know it's like one of my top favorites of the year because I got so emotionally connected to it. Coming in at number 7 on my list is going to be The Storied Life of AJ Fikry. This book had such a huge impact on me this year. Like, I loved this so much more than I thought I would. This story, we're just following this man named AJ, and he is really going through it, you know, at the beginning of this book because his wife has recently passed away. He owns this bookstore and he's like trying to run it by himself, but like the bookstore is just not doing very well. And also one of his rare books that he's collected that he was planning to sell and like retire with the money has been stolen. And so like he is not having a good time. AJ is like one of those characters that you're following that like at the beginning of this book, it just feels like the world is against him and like all of these things that could go wrong are going wrong, and he just feels very defeated and kind of like over it. But then the stories about how like things start to happen in his life that make him realize like, oh my god, maybe life is worth living and maybe there's reason to have hope again. So well done and so beautiful, and I connected with these characters so much. Also, I feel like what makes this book so special and unique compared to some of the other books I've read that are like this is because AJ is such a big book lover, and I feel like this book was really written for book lovers. You know, like there's so many great quotes in this book about like book people and about how like book people are like the best people that you're gonna meet, and just like so many conversations about like why books are so special and so important and like why reading is so special. And I loved, oh my god, the atmosphere in this book was so great because it mostly like takes place on this little island where he like owns the only bookstore in town, and like the locals are so sweet. Like I loved all of the characters. It was almost giving like Schitt's Creek with the way that like you just care about all of the characters in this small town. Like it was so cute. I just, oh my god, I loved this. Like reading this book felt like a warm hug, you know, and especially around like the holiday season, I think this would be such a good book to read for like something that's just very comforting and very wholesome. I do think this is going to be one that I'll come back to and reread time and time again because it is just very comforting and very wholesome, and it reminds me why I love reading in the first place. All right, coming in at number 6 on my list is going to be Incidents Around the House by Josh Malerman. We have a book troop pick that made it into my top 10. Let's go! Josh Malerman is one of my favorite authors writing in the horror genre right now, and I think that this is like my favorite Josh Malerman, which is crazy to say because I've loved so many books from him. The story is so interesting and so unique. In this story, we're following this young 8-year-old girl named Bella who's living with her mom and her dad, and then she has this other thing called Other Mommy that lives in her closet. And she comes out at night and she is starting to ask Bella if she can go inside her heart. It was so fascinating to read from the perspective of a young kid who doesn't really understand like how creepy things are, who doesn't really understand like the danger that she could be in because of the situation, you know. And like I just really loved and connected with the characters in this book. Oh my god, like the relationship between Bella and her dad is like one of my favorite things that I've read this whole year. They were so freaking cute. But I think what I really loved about this book is that there were so many beautiful quotes about like growing up and like the fear of growing up and like not recognizing yourself or the world anymore. I loved the conversations that she would have with her dad in this book when he would be like, I think the goal is to stay kind for as long as you can, no matter what happens to you and no matter what you go through, no matter how many breaks you get and how many you don't. Like the little like life lessons that he would give to her sometimes at the end of the night, it was just so sweet and so wholesome. Like I loved their characters. There was so much conversation in this book about how like children view fear in a way that feels so different from adults because children still have such like wild imaginations, you know, whereas like adults are more set in their ways and they start to accept reality for what it is. And there were so many conversations about how like one day the problems that you're facing right now will just be a memory, you know, and like you'll be able to get through things. And like every day that you're still alive is proof that you've overcome your fears in some way. Like I just wasn't expecting this book to be as deep as it was. Like I literally was crying at the end of this. Like it was beautiful. It was so well done. But I also think not only was this book chock full of like some really beautiful and inspirational moments, but then also it was so creepy at times. Oh my god, Bella's descriptions of this other mommy creature thing, oh my god, it was so disgusting and horrifying. Like absolutely horrifying. Like there was a few scenes that I was like, oh hell no. Like that is so creepy. I think not only does Josh Malerman accomplish such a beautiful, moving story about this family, like I was so connected to these characters, but at the same time to be able to actually make this book so terrifying and horrifying with this other mommy creature thing, I just loved it. Like this is everything that I love in horror. All right, getting into my top 5. How exciting. Coming in at number 5, I have The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. And this is another horror book that I was absolutely obsessed with this year. It was a really great year for horror, if you couldn't tell. This is a book that just really, really worked for me, and there is a lot of very gruesome body horror in this book, but like the social commentary that was packed into this book was actually incredible. In this story, we're following this young girl named Ji-won, and she's a young Korean girl living in California with her family, and her family are kind of going through like a rough period, you know, because like their dad has recently like abandoned their family, and their mom is not doing very well as a result of that. And so her mom keeps telling their daughters to like eat the eyeballs of the fish when they're having dinner, because the eyeballs are supposed to bring you good luck when you eat them. And so she starts to eat the eyeballs, and at first she's kind of like disgusted by it, but then she starts to like it so much to the point where she starts to get this obsession and fascination with the idea of eating human eyeballs. And then her mom starts dating this new white man named George, who is just like the biggest red flag ever and like disgusting. Gosh, this book was just so good. It was so gruesome. There were so many scenes in this book that were like absolutely disgusting, like with the eyeball thing, and like so hard to read. Like the descriptions were just so gory and over the top with the body horror, but it was so well done. And there was so much great social commentary in this book, not only with like, you know, how difficult it can be to be a woman in America, and also like so many great conversations about race as well, with her being Korean living in America. There was just so much to love about this book, and the ending was so satisfying. And it's just very disturbing, you know, to read about this young girl slowly becoming so unhinged. I think her character was very interesting to follow, because you don't even know, you know, she's kind of like one of those like morally gray characters where like you don't even really know if you're supposed to be rooting for her or not. And I love that about this. Like I thought that made it even more interesting. Coming in at number 4 on my list is my favorite horror book I think that I've read this year, and that is The Horror by David Sodergren. Oh my god, I just love this. I read this book twice this year. There's something about this book in particular that just really, really works for me, and I think it's that it's a horror book that has like this emotional kind of tie to the story. Like I feel emotionally invested in this. And in this story, we're following this 80-year-old protagonist, and her name is Muriel, and she's living in this little Scottish fishing village. And right at the start of this book, we find out that these men who are like, you know, millionaire billionaires, they come in and they're like, hey, we're gonna need you to move because we're gonna use this land to build a golf course. And so like she's gonna be evacuated. She has to leave her home. And so she's very stubborn, and she's like, absolutely not. Like I am not leaving my home. And so she's very stubborn and she's not gonna leave. And so it starts to create some problems for her with these men. And then one night, the fog rolls in, the horror as they call it, and it brings with it something that is truly horrifying. You can imagine. It's only about like 209 pages. Like it is not a long story, but like my god, this story was so good. Like this is like everything that I love in horror. It's almost written in this way where it's like fairy tale like, or like the writing is just so beautiful, and it really makes you like emotionally invested in Muriel as a character, and like her situation is just so heartbreaking. But also like the actual horror in this book is so gory and so grotesque. Like some of the most disturbing shit that I've read in a horror book all year long. Like this author does not hold back on the gore and the bloodiness. Like I can tell you that. It is pretty extreme, and sometimes it's really hard to stomach. But like the story of Muriel and like what she's going through, oh my god, it was so powerful and it was so beautiful. And like by the ending of this book, I was crying. I really think if you like The Shape of Water, I think you would like this. If you like Pet Sematary, I think you would love this. This one also reminds me of a very particular episode of Black Mirror that I don't want to say because I feel like it would spoil you, but like, oh my god, this one was just so good. It reminded me of so many other things that I love, and like I just connected with it so much. Like I had to read it twice this year, you know? I read it the first time during Summerween, which was so amazing. And since reading this book, I have read like 3 books from this author. Like I can't get enough. Right, coming in at number 3 is going to be Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. Oh my gosh, can you believe that we have a BookTube pick that made it into my top 3 books of the whole year? Wow, I've really turned things around this year, and I'm so happy about it. No, I was debating all year long if this book was gonna be like my #1 favorite book of the year, because I read this back in January, and there's something so uniquely special about the way that this book was written that just really struck a chord with me, and it hit me so hard. I mean, I do have an entire live show discussing this book with full spoilers spoilers, talking about every single thing that I love about it. So if you want to see that, I will have the live show link down below. So this one is technically considered like a mystery thriller, but I think it's more of a like literary fiction, even more like historical fiction in some ways, because some of this book takes place in like the 1970s. So this story is actually inspired by like the real life sorority that was attacked by Ted Bundy. But this story is all about like taking the narrative away from Ted Bundy and kind of bringing it back to being a story that's about the women and about how they've survived. And you know, even the title of this book, it's called Bright Young Women because, as you might recall, you know, when Ted Bundy was in the courtroom, the judge who was literally on this case told Ted Bundy like, oh, well, you're a bright young man and you had such a great future ahead of you if only you didn't do these things, partner. The judge was like very, very friendly with Ted Bundy, you know, like a freaking serial killer in the courtroom. And so this book is literally called Bright Young Women as kind of like a fuck you to that judge, being like, why are you calling a serial killer a bright young man? There's so much conversation in this book about the language that we use to talk about serial killers. You know, like, why are we calling this man charming? Why are we calling him a mastermind? Like, we use all this like friendly language, you know, like when we talk about these serial killers. And I loved in this book the way that she just like picks apart any little thing that you could say about a serial killer or about any man like that. And she dismisses any of those ideas and just, oh my God, it's so beautifully written. One of the quotes that I really loved was when she said, law enforcement would rather remember a dull man as brilliant than take a good hard look at the role they played in this absolute sideshow. And I am sick to death of watching them in their pressed shirts and their cowboy boots and their comfortable leather interview chairs in hugely successful and critically acclaimed crime documentaries talking about the intelligence and charm and willingness of an ordinary misogynist. I just love this so much because I feel like this book also points out just how difficult it is to be a woman in the world who is never respected and never trusted, and she can never say anything without the police thinking that she's over-exaggerating. There were just so many great quotes in this book talking about why language matters so much when you're discussing these things, because it shapes the narrative. You know, like it changes how we as a society view certain things because of the language that they're using in the news. I also love the fact that this author never one time mentions Ted Bundy's name, or like they never mention his name. They always say the defendant when they're talking about him. So like he's never named throughout the entire book, which I think is so powerful because it's like it's taking the spotlight away from this man and shining a spotlight on the women. And I just loved everything about this. I thought that this book was so gorgeously written and it was so powerful because it wasn't just the story of Pamela, but we do get the perspective of like a few different women throughout the book, and we do get like alternating timelines. Like we do get flashbacks to like the 1970s and then in the present day. There's like a lot of different stories happening in this book and I just loved all of them. Like I thought it was all so well done and so moving. Like the ending literally almost made me cry. Like there were a few moments throughout this book that brought me to tears. All right, coming in at number 2 on my list is going to be Once There Were Wolves. I read this pretty early on in the year. I read this back in February, and all year long I've been like trying to figure out like, is this my number 1 favorite book that I've read this year? I'm so glad that I read this book because this one's actually, you know, it's a backlist book. It didn't even publish this year. I've had this on my shelves now for a few years. And this story is about this woman named Inti who arrives in Scotland with her twin sister, and their job is basically going to be to reintroduce these gray wolves into their society in Scotland. And like the story sounds like it would be so like not something that I would want to read, like I don't know, but this one is written in a way where it's kind of like a literary thriller. The locals there, like they really don't want these wolves around, and so there's a situation where like somebody gets murdered, question mark, like they don't know what happened to this person, but then of course like the locals are gonna blame it on the wolves because they don't want them there, and then the police are trying to figure out like, was this a human that did this, and they're trying to set it up like the wolves did it, or did the wolves actually do this? And this book worked for me for so many reasons, but like, oh my God, there's something about like the literary thrillers that are just really doing it for me. Like I loved this so much. The writing was so atmospheric. I love that this took place in Scotland, but then also in Alaska, because these two young girls, they grew up in Alaska, and so we do get a lot of flashbacks to their childhood when they were growing up. And you know, as somebody who's really close to their sister, I really connected with the story a lot because of that. I loved Inti so much and I related to her so much because there was so much conversation about how she never felt like she was tough enough, and like her parents would say that she was like too sensitive and like she needed to grow thicker skin to like face the world. I just found her so relatable for a lot of those reasons. I also loved the conversations in this book about violence and how violence looks different between humans versus animals. There was a really great quote where she said, "There are languages without words and violence is one of them." I love when she says, "I think it's civilization that makes us violent. We infect each other. I used to think people were good. I used to think we were mostly kind, all of us forgivable, but now I know better." Oh, there were just so many great quotes about like how violence in humanity is ignored. I really, really loved the sister relationship in this book. I loved the atmosphere. I was so invested in the mystery in this book too. Like the mystery, like once the story gets going going with that. Oh my god, it's so fascinating. There was even like a subtle romance happening in this book that I was so invested in, and I was like kicking my feet, like screaming. Like, I loved this. By the ending of this book, I was like sobbing, and I wanted to give this like 6 stars. Like, I was like, this is a 6-star book. I love this so much. I even reread this one in the month of December, and I can just say, like, it still stands up. It's still so good. Okay, and it's time for my number 1 favorite book of 2024, and this book made my number 1 spot for very personal reasons, and that is Blue Sisters by Coco Mellers. Oh man, this has got to be my number 1 favorite book of the year, and I've spent so many days. What is my number 1 favorite? Like, I was going back and forth between these 3 that are in my top 3, but I think this one, like, I have to be real with myself. This is my favorite book of this year because for a very personal reason. As I mentioned earlier, you know, like, I am somebody that's very close to my sister, and so this book just really hit home for me and made me so emotional. I actually just read this book in the month of November. Like, this is a pretty recent read for me. In this story, this one's kind of a literary fiction book that's following these 4 sisters. You know, I do love the literary fiction that follows sisters. I eat that shit up. Like, I absolutely love it. But this one was especially hard hitting because one of the 4 sisters has recently passed away. And then this story is taking place about a year after their sister has passed away. And it's about the other 3 sisters and how they're trying to, you know, try to figure out how to live their life without their sister, and how they just don't really feel whole anymore because it's like they're missing a piece of themselves because they don't have their sister anymore. But I think why this one really struck a chord with me and why I really love this is because before their sister had died, she had been dealing with endometriosis, which is not a spoiler, by the way. Like, they talk about it right at the beginning, but because she had this, you know, endometriosis that she was dealing with in her life, they talk about how, like, she was always dealing with this, like, invisible pain that, like, nobody was taking seriously. The doctors would always be asking her, well, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, like, how bad is your pain? And she was always struggling to try to emphasize, like, how much pain she was in, and she didn't want to be dramatic, but she wanted to be taken seriously, and how, like, she never really found the relief that she was looking for. And like, oh my god, that part just like really got to me because like, if you've known like the story of like my sister and like some of her health issues since the year of 2020, like, she's had some problems with her kidneys, and like, sorry, it's literally gonna make me cry. What the heck? Because like, as the oldest sister, with like wanting to protect your younger sister and like not being able to do anything about it, like when things are so out of your control and you just want to protect your siblings and there's nothing you can do, like, holy shit, I related to that a lot. Oh, what the fuck? Why am I crying? I also just think so many of the quotes about like sisterhood in general, like, it just made me so happy, and I feel like this book just really gets it, you know, like how special it is to have a sister. When they say a sister is not a friend, true sisterhood, the kind where you grew fingernails in the same womb, were pushed screaming through identical birth canals, is not the same as friendship. You don't choose each other. There's no furtive period of getting to know the other. You're part of each other right from the start. Look at an umbilical cord, a tough, sinuous, unlovely, yet essential, and compare it to a friendship bracelet of brightly woven thread. That is the difference between a sister and a friend. There was also this really great quote about sisters too, when she said, before she ever knew a lover's body, she knew her sisters, could see herself in their long feet and light eyes, their sleek limbs and curled ears, and before life became big and difficult, there were moments with them when it was simply good. Safe in the center of her sisters, not knowing or needing to know where she ended and the next began. They were love, they were beautiful and unbearable and hers. That is so stunning. And the conversations about like, trust me, you don't really know me unless you know my sister, because like, we're basically 2 halves of a whole. I just loved that so much. I really related. There's a moment too that really stuck with me in this book when she just said, you are not that important. And like, if you read the book, then like, you know what that scene's about. And like, oh my god, it has stuck with me so much. Like, I've been thinking about that line every single day since I finished this book. This book just left such a huge impact on me personally. I mean, clearly I can barely talk about it without crying, but like, there was so much more than just the sisterhood about this story that I loved. I mean, there were so many great conversations about grief and about addiction and like why somebody could even fall into addiction in the first place, and like how hard it can be to like fall back in love with life when you've been really going through hard things. And I loved that, you know, the sisters in this book, they were very close, but they also had very complex and interesting relationships with each other. You know, like, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows with them. Like, they definitely had their problems, but it was written in a way that just felt so real and so interesting, and I just really loved every single one of these characters. Oh my god, I could go on all day about how much Blue Sisters meant to me, but I feel like I've talked enough about it. Like, oh my god, can I stop crying please? Thanks. So yeah, wow, those are all of my top favorite books that I read in 2024. I know my number 1 might have been surprising, but it's like, the more that I think about it, the more that I'm absolutely positive that Blue Sisters is going to be the book that stays with me the most out of everything that I've read this year. But wow, you'll have to let me know if you've read any of the books on my list. Let me know, are there any that also made your top favorites of the year? I would love to know what your thoughts are on all of these books. And also, let me know what are your like top 3, your top 5, your top 10 favorite books that you've read this year. If you want to sound off in the comments, I'll be looking through because I love to see at the end of the year what everybody's favorites are. You know, like I really want to know. So thank you so much for watching. As always, I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye!